Hello, Sean.
Hello. Seriously? Seriously? That's
I
how we're going into 2023?
thought I'd throw you off. Sean, my
Yeah,
man.
2023, baby.
2023. Pew, 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 pew. Nice. How are you?
Oh, I'm good. Had a happy new year. It's
Good.
January is going to be gone, and actually 2023 will probably be gone before we know it.
I know. It does feel like everything is moving very, very, very quickly. I too had a nice new year. So praises be for that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So this is our first podcast of the year. We
Yeah.
took a little bit of a break in December, and of course jazzed us up for this podcast. But before we get into that, what are you drinking?
In honor of my son who turned 21 on the first day of January 2023,
Wow.
I am consuming Casamigos tequila.
Oh, come on. I didn't know this is not called tequila beer in bold conversation.
It isn't, but I'm switching it up since you delved into bourbon at the end of last year.
Okay.
I figured nope, all bets were on. How's that?
Yeah, well, that's so congratulations, happy birthday to him and to you all.
Thank you.
That is a big milestone. He was there with you, I assume.
Yeah, we had him for a whole month. So Nick and I were very happy and blessed and sad to see him go. So yeah.
When did he leave?
Actually last week on Wednesday.
Okay.
So he got in on the 9th of December, I think, or 8th of December.
Good.
And turned around just last week. But also part of that is the fact that, dear listeners, the University of California schools are going through a strike by their teacher assistants, the TAs, and the graduate assistants who are who have unionized and want more pay for the work that they do, which I actually do not think is a bad proposition. So some of his classes are being impacted by that as professors are asked to take on more load. They've been offloading assignments, which for him is great. I don't know where I fall on that from the person that's footing the tuition bill, which will not be reduced.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
My lovely partner and I won't have any more money in retirement based on this, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So anyway, yeah. What about you, man? How the kids doing?
Yeah, Mackenzie went back last week, I guess. This past week was our first week back. Declan is preparing for an internship in New York City that he and I will go up there in a week.
Excellent.
And he'll spend 3 months in a recording studio. So we're very excited about that. So, Mackenzie was gone out of North Carolina last semester for her fall semester, and Declan will be gone this semester. So we're looking forward to graduation in May.
Wow. Wow.
So because
what you drinking?
I am drinking, it's called Straight Talk by Hardywood Craft Brewery in Richmond, Virginia.
Okay.
I've had this one before. It's a Belgian quad, so it is quite boozy yet creamy. It's boozy because it's at 14%. Yeah. So anyways, I chose this because I think not only with this year, but this, kind of start off this year is for us to maybe have more straight talk.
Yeah.
Because what I have found, Clayton, I'm sure you have too, is the focus around, at least racially, comparing it to what was going on in 2020 with the George Floyd murder.
Yeah.
It seems like things are continuing to settle a bit, even though things continue to happen.
Yeah.
So, I think what I've constantly focused on is how do you get more white men involved in the work? And that's not always easy.
Right.
And so I think we have to have some straight talk about why they're not involved. What are some of the pitfalls, what we can do to get them involved. and because they play such an important role, or can play an important role in change, whether that's societal or in companies. And so we need them. We need them involved. So that's what we're going to talk about today.
I love it. I could not agree with you more. And this is also where we started, right? When we when you first called and checked on me, right? We started at this space, and what you were modeling was a white guy trying to get in the game at a very small contextual level, but nonetheless one that was very important and created the ripples that got us here, right?
Yeah. So. Yeah. Well, and you, like I said, it's waned a bit, but this stuff still happens. And there was a teacher in California that I'm trying to remember, Keenan Anderson. He's 31-year-old teacher, high school teacher in California that got tased, and then I want to say he later died because of that.
Yeah, the gentleman that one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, that was her cousin. Right. Yeah, got it. Yeah, I saw that. Yeah.
So, it hasn't gone away. It just doesn't. We don't have some of the visuals and the audio like we had, and I mean like full-fledged, marches and things like that. So.
Yeah. I mean, again, I think, as you and I have discussed many times before, we can't think of this change, either societal or in the corporate environment, as linear. It's more loop to loop, where we will continue to kind of advance, but then we loop back almost, and have to regress a little bit to advance even further. So yeah, no, I'm with you. But it was interesting, right? Because one of the things that you wrote when we were prepping around this was sort of, what's this idea around white men engaging, around finding their voice and commitment around their advocacy? Why is it limited? Why do they negatively react? And how could flipping all of those things result positively for the scope of the work that we do corporately and in society, as well as sort of the pace of DE&I change, right? And you said something about, fundamental for our listeners to think about is, what is this idea of group membership, right? So did I paraphrase that right?
Yeah, you did. So you had done such a nice job in the past describing group membership. Remember when you talked about shirt color?
Yeah.
Can you remind our listeners? You remember that?
I do. So I got another example, but let me slide back and we want to make sure that you all have some basis for what we're going to talk about next, and some of the maybe reasons why white guys don't engage, some of the reasons why they should, et cetera, et cetera. But it all hinges on this idea that Sean mentioned of group membership. And so I'm going to be real brief on this, but the more power or privilege that you have. And so I look at myself as a person from my various group memberships that has a lot of power as a man, has a lot of power and privilege as a heterosexual, as a cisgendered male. But the more power and privilege that I have and experience, then the more the default is for me to see myself as an individual, right? And so what that means is that when I look out at the world, I say, oh, well, the world opens up for me a certain way, therefore it must open up for everyone else the same way. And from the perspective of being a man, from the perspective of being a heterosexual, I am not impacted often by how others see me. Right? Because I don't often feel the ill effects of those two group memberships, men and heterosexual. But for those of us with significant out-group membership, so I also happen to be, as you all know, dear listener, Black or African American, I live the impact of not being seen as an individual, but as part of a group, again, Black or African American, and often suffer the negative consequences of that association. So to really wrap that in a bow quickly, on the one hand, as a man, I don't feel ill impacted when women look at me and say, oh gosh, here's another man coming down the street. When other people, gay folks, look at me and go, here's another heterosexual coming down the street, a straight dude, right? I don't feel that impact, because there is no impact. I have the power and the privilege in that. Yet as an African American, I do often feel the impact when others look at me and say, oh gosh, here's a Black person coming down the street, right?
Yeah.
My quick story is the elevator example, where when you're working late at night and you get in the elevator, when I get in them with women, often I would notice that they would clutch their purses. And my first reaction before I went through this great diversity work was to always say, well, gosh, why are they looking at me like that? Right. I'm Black, but I'm wearing a suit. I am carrying a briefcase. I am whatever. Right. What I never leaned into until I started doing this work was this idea of what did it mean to be in that group called men. Right. And leaning into the idea that men do, in fact, still visit today a multitude of violences against women. Right. And so within that moment, being a little bit not desirous of having violence committed against them in that low stakes sort of environment for me, but high stakes for them, how could owning that group membership man lead us to better interactions, right? And so I know I've talked a lot often about how I do that, but I just wanted to bring that up and kind of try to wrap it up with that example that we want you to lean into this idea of group, and we're going to be talking about that a lot today. So Sean, is that helpful? Did I leave anything out?
No, I just add to it because we got Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day coming up.
Yep.
And this, one of his quotes that a lot of people use, and especially those that want to minimize or erase group membership, is that quote around, judge people by the content of the character, not the color of the skin.
Yep.
So color of the skin is group level.
Yep.
Content of character is that individual level.
Oh, I love that.
And
yep.
I think so. I want to say that I agree with that quote. I love that quote. I think we all should aspire to see people around us as individuals and the content of their character.
Right.
Right. I think everyone should aspire to that. I think what we have to go through, and you and I have, had the privilege of going through some deep learning, is recognize that maybe we're not seeing everyone at group level, or I'm sorry, at the individual level.
Yeah.
We want to believe we're seeing the content of character, but because these groups have been constructed, some are seen as, some get benefits and some get disadvantages.
Yeah.
Even though as an individual, you may not do anything for it.
Right.
So an example of, like you were saying, around as men and not having to worry about as much violence, is to realize that, society was created where, men, if any, men are the perpetrators of the violence, or there is a pattern of behavior of sexual violence or sexual assault against women. So I don't have to worry about that when I go into certain places.
Right. That
I'm going to be harassed or assaulted. And I didn't do anything to set up that system.
Right.
So I get seen as being a man and therefore not being a target.
Yeah.
Or even being treated unconsciously in a negative way. So when I think about this whole idea of white men, it's really hard. I run into some resistance of just using the term, because white men means that it's a group of people.
Yeah.
Right. And to your point, many white men, and me included, have not always realized that I get seen that way in the world, and therefore I get treated a certain way.
Yep. Which generally has advantages.
It generally has an advantage by race or gender. And that's the other thing that our listeners need to work through, is that it's solely because of my race or solely because of my gender. Like you said, I might have some other things that the world reminds me that I'm at a disadvantage.
Yep.
Or disadvantaged. But there are many things that I experience because the system was created for white men in particular. So this is at the very beginning of our arriving on the shores.
Yeah.
Race was a something that was constructed in kind of early 1600s, and it was over in England, I think, as the British Empire was running into Eastern Indians, and then as we got into the the racial slave trade,
Yeah.
where there was this construct where white people were seen as, more capable as anyone else. So I think what's hard for us, and we're dealing with right now in our history, is, how do we talk about this and it not be a situation where it's a blame game,
Yeah.
mm, or that particular group, right? White men feel that it's only about blame, but also recognize that, what, we've been talking about this for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
So it's not just new that everybody's coming up and starting to use white men as a label. We actually created, the country, giving benefits to those that white men who own property
Right.
and no one else.
Yeah.
So uh, again, it's been around for a while. It's just, I think what has happened, Clayton, is white men were kind of defined by, the radicals like the KKK, and so
Mm-hmm.
uh, I think when white men hear the term, they take it in as being called a racist and or a sexist.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And that's why I think we try to be tight around our definitions of what those things are when we're talking about it. And so what I would say is that we're, helping as at the individual level understand that really is bigotry. And anyone can be a bigot, right? It doesn't matter whether you have power or not. It's often about perception and preference. When groups of people or individuals get together, they can discriminate. And again, that can be contextual, right? So, that doesn't matter societally as well. But then the ism is when there are things in the structural fabric of the culture, laws, customs that serve either to advantage or disadvantage, right? And so that's one of the things that I want to be really clear on, because I want to take it out of the charged space,
Mm-hmm.
if I can, a little bit, Sean, right? I don't think, never will I walk up to a white person that I haven't had dialogue or interaction with and go, "You're racist," right? No, never, 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 right? And even after I have dialogue, probably not, because again, it's the system. Now, they very well might be bigoted, and they might get together with others of their ilk and certainly practice discrimination. But I think the racism charge shuts people down. I think we have contextualized it such that we don't want to have a conversation.
Yeah, and it makes me think about why it's so hard and what are
Yeah,
the
exactly.
challenges for white men to be in the game.
Yep.
And some of that is that they don't want to say the wrong thing or do the wrong thing,
Yeah.
um, because it does feel so heated.
Yep.
And I've been there, and I still am there. There are times when I'm in situations where, I am concerned. I feel like I'm walking on eggshells. That if I say the wrong thing, then I'm going to be kind of tagged that going forward.
Yeah.
And we all have to realize that we're learning and we're going to make some mistakes. And I think there's a lot more people out there that have good intention,
Yes.
just don't have the skill or the awareness or the experience of being around people that have given them some type of feedback, and had to move through that. I mean, I said a lot of dumb things. I still say a lot of dumb things.
No comment.
Yeah, I'm gonna validate
I will
that.
join you though in saying that I also say a lot of dumb things, and the idea is really is to accept that, forgive yourself, ask forgiveness for others when you screwed up, stay in the game, and exercise your curiosity. Right? As I know you've heard us say before, from an ally perspective, and everyone can either be an ally or have an ally. When you have that thing that disadvantages you, often what you want from your allies is simply for them to be in the boat with you. They don't have to be perfect, just be in the boat. So stay there. One of the other things that caught me on, or really sparked some thought in me, is you said that sometimes a win for diversity, quote unquote, is a loss for me as a white guy. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's kind of that idea of zero sum game. And
Yeah.
Heather McGee, she might be Dr. Heather McGee, wrote a book, The Sum of Us,
Yeah.
which is really putting it out there that we're all impacted by racism,
Absolutely.
one way or
Yeah.
another. So an example is, back in the maybe 50s and 60s, when there was a need to integrate the public pools.
Hmm.
because they were segregated. And some municipalities actually closed the pool so they didn't have to integrate.
Right.
And that not only impacted, Black person's access,
Yeah.
it impacted white people's ability to go to a pool,
Yeah.
right? So there is this idea that one wins and one loses. So, yeah, I think we do, especially when we look at increasing the representation at levels of leadership and
Yeah.
influence and decision making. Oftentimes there are minimum opportunities.
Yeah.
And so if
Yeah.
you have 10
They're
people,
limited, right? They're very
yeah.
limited.
So if you have 10 people sitting around the table, basically leading the organization, making decisions that are impacting, could be 25 people, could be 250,000 people. They're typically just going to be limited to those 10. And so if we're going to increase racial or ethnic or gender representation, it feels like, well, then I'm not going to get opportunities anymore as a white guy.
Yeah.
So I think that's part of it, is that they don't necessarily like this because it feels like it's a zero-sum game. It feels like it's reverse discrimination.
Yeah. Well, we've had that conversation too,
Yeah.
right? Discrimination is just discrimination. And I want to be really clear, to be put a particular point on this. In individual situations, there absolutely could be impact. But what I would draw your attention to, dear listener, is the idea that when Black people, when white women, when other ethnicities, for the hundreds of years that we couldn't even get in the game, that also was intentional. And that also was a situation where there were individuals that were impacted by a system that was set up. So Dr. Martin Luther King also said something that I enjoy that doesn't get a lot of airplay. I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't know it exactly. But essentially, he said, if great harm has been done to the Negro, then perhaps there has to be great repair done as well. Right. And so what I take that to mean is that perhaps it needs to be, for a time, extraordinary measure to lift us up, because there was such an extraordinary measure done to keep us down.
Yeah.
But I also know that a lot of white folks aren't aware of all of that, particularly now, because you talked about slavery, Sean. What a lot of folks, when we do our corporate stuff, you and I both get, is we get this idea, or people telling us at least, well, I didn't own slaves, right? My parents didn't own slaves. I grew up working class, and yet they're unaware or in denial even about why we need corporate equity and inclusion programming, right? Or they blame people who talk about equity and inclusion programming like you and I as trying to divide us, right? And so you talked a little bit about some of the things that I would say are rooted in fear. I just wanted to bring out that sometimes it's rooted in denial, and sometimes it's also rooted in judgment, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And to be fair, it's new. This shift is new for white men, and
yeah,
I think we often get raised in feeling like we have some level of control.
Yep.
And when this starts to shift a bit, and we start to see that there's a need and a desire to increase the diversity, then it feels like we may not be as in control anymore.
Yeah.
Where maybe, if the things that helped me in the past may not help me going forward. So I think there's some of that as well. As we have this conversation, it makes me think about what's going on right now with the NFL. And you've got 32 teams, or 32 head coaches. I think at the end of the season, there may have been 3 to 4 head coaches.
Yeah.
One was an interim coach for the Panthers. And now we're doing all the hiring. And I don't know if this statistic is right for the NFL, or maybe it's the NBA, but I assume the NFL is probably 60 to 70% Black players.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
I don't know the statistics of the coaches outside of the head coach, but that's a large percentage of players. And then you have, 3 Black head coaches. And there was good intent with the Rooney Rule that you should be interviewing a Black coach, because usually those are the ones out there, for every job that's open. So
yeah.
Even though you've had that rule for many years, that really hasn't shifted much.
Yeah, the number always hovers right around that 10%, that 3 out of 32.
Right, which is higher than probably what's happening. I mean, you could probably, again, I should have done my homework, but there's probably 3, maybe 5 CEOs in the Fortune 500 who are
Yeah.
Black.
Yeah.
Right. So we've been, I assume the things that we're talking about today, actually, I don't assume, I've read, are the same things that were happening in the mid to late 50s into the 60s as the civil rights movement was heightening, and we were seeing some laws being passed. These were the same things that people were afraid of, white people in particular, that it was going to be kind of a flip the script. And
Yeah.
let's think about that. That's 40 to 50 years from now or ago. And what change have we made at the CEO level
Yeah.
and at the NFL level? And not much, right? So
Right.
even though there's a fear that it's a zero-sum game, there are still plenty of white men who are getting hired.
Absolutely. Right. And
I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say, I think that's such a great, way or segue into this idea. Another one that you and I were talking about when we were kind of planning was thinking about actually being able to have your leadership effectiveness enhanced even, right, by being able to be more open and more inclusive and more equitable. So you're still getting opportunities, but you can get an opportunity. And in this case, because you embrace equity and inclusion, you actually can make yourself a better leader,
Right. Yeah. And like you said, that the difference between individual and group level and even system level is that, yes, the individual who was a white guy who has worked hard and may have thought that he was going to be the next CEO or the next VP or the next head coach, when he doesn't get that opportunity, it might very well feel like all of these things that we've talked about.
Yeah.
So for that individual, that might be his truth.
Right.
And we then have to look at, well, it's a different experience for white men at the group level.
Yeah.
Because the system continues to define white men as the model of success.
Right.
And that makes it more challenging for other groups.
So assuming there is, though, some impetus, right, from all that we've been saying for the past 20 minutes or so, and some of our white friends are out there listening, talk a little bit about what white men particularly can do to get in the game, if you will.
Well, you said, I think you gave a strong business case or even human case that given how we live today as a global society, I just don't think you can be as effective of a leader if you're not learning and adjusting and being more inclusive with many people around you.
Yeah.
So I think it is an imperative today. And I think what we see with some of the, a small percentage of the CEOs who are white men is that they understand that and they are putting themselves in positions to learn, to mess up, to get feedback, to engage, to adapt, to change, all of these things. So I think you did a good job of setting the stage of why this is important. Let's just say from a professional experience or from a leadership perspective.
Yeah. And one of the things I found so powerful in coaching, working with these individuals is something you said, again, while we were planning, was they have their own personal reason for wanting to do this work. Right. It is not just the outside pressure, the external. Because that's the party line. Anyone can say that equity and inclusion is important. And if you're a CEO who's dumb enough to say it isn't, then probably you shouldn't be a CEO. Excuse my judgment. But the best ones that I've worked with have their own personal, owned, authentic reason why they want to do the work.
Yeah. And they have to, I think that's where I start with each of the executives when I talk, not executives, but any of the leaders.
Yeah.
Who are white men in particular. I always start with, why is DE&I important? And they may not have ever thought about that.
Right. Yep.
Partly because DE&I is a misunderstood approach. But when you really get down to it, I think all of us want to be in environments where everyone, no matter the color of your skin, your gender, or what have you, we want to be treated with respect. We want to be included. And sometimes what white men have to do is dig a little bit deeper and
Yeah.
get to a sense of why this is important. And what I find, Clayton, is that they can connect to the importance when they're connecting to an outsider group,
Yeah.
whether their own or someone that they love or a friend.
Absolutely.
So I think one thing that we have to do as white men in particular is find the reasons why you want to create a better environment. And that could
Yeah.
be an inclusive environment, a client, or an environment of respect, but find that reason, because if we don't find those reasons, then we're not going to have the resilience to do the work that we need to do.
Yeah.
So that's
Absolutely.
the first thing, is find your reason. The second is assess.
Yeah.
Again, I know when I went into the development program 20 years ago or so, I thought I was pretty good,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and I was good at the individual level, but I didn't really understand that there are some things that I could do at the group level to
Yeah.
create change. And so I think some part of this is we have to assess where we are around our groups.
Yeah, and hang in there, right? Again, we define what group membership was, but being able to own your group membership, being able to own that other people might see you in a certain way, not just as an individual, but as a group member, and then lean into that, right? We often, when we are given feedback that does not jive with who we think we are, or maybe negative even, we often run straight to being defensive. Well, I didn't mean that, or why are you being so sensitive, or you misunderstood, versus leaning in. And one of my favorite phrases when I get feedback is, say more about that. Right. And it doesn't mean that you have to take an action on every piece of feedback that you get, but it does mean you're willing to hear it. And then hopefully think about it and see, does it apply? And look at the pattern, right? Has that same situation or feedback point cropped up in other relationships at other points in time? Think about it longitudinally as well, not just within the situation, because if you can own that group and know that you have rarely, particularly when you're in your in-group, been disadvantaged for being an in-group member, then you can use that same power, that same access, that same privilege to advance different others, particularly out-group members. So I think that's an important one. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and it's hard.
Oh yeah.
Hard, especially what I find harder, Clayton, is work around gender.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because that is what I've been around for my whole life.
Yeah.
Now, race, I haven't been around, and I have been around. Sometimes I didn't see it, but it's not something that was something I experienced every single day. So as a man, or as a boy, and as a man, I have been, gender is always there. So my assessment is to start to realize that, okay, I'm behaving a certain way as an individual, but there's also these group norms that influence how I behave.
Yes. Right.
So if I go to a party and it's mixed by gender, being defined as man and woman, then I start to get influenced by how I should behave.
Yeah.
And so it may mean that I don't know, maybe I banter more with people around me. Maybe I don't offer to help as much. There are certain things that I know I do that I get influenced by the norms that have been put in place. So that's, I know for me, is something I can do a better job of assessing. How am I behaving versus the group? How do men usually behave in these situations?
Yeah.
The society has set norms in terms of who cares for whom. And
yeah,
so
absolutely.
Parties, or we talk about Christmas, Thanksgiving, these major events, it's typically the women that are doing the food, setting the table, cleaning off the table, and men typically don't do that. Now, individual men might do that,
right?
But there's a pattern of group behavior. So that's what we have to assess: is where am I, and where am I in my group?
Yeah, absolutely right. And you said something, and so I love you. So next thing I'm going to say is out of love, right? You said you didn't experience race. I'd put a little bit of a finer point in it. What I would say, so that we don't confuse our listeners, is that your experience with race was either neutral or advantageous, which then did not prompt you to think about what that experience with race as being a white person was.
Yeah, well, yes, and I'd say that I'm speaking of experiencing race on a daily basis.
Yeah.
with a contrast of a person of color or people of color.
Absolutely. Yeah. So as a disadvantage.
Yes.
Yeah,
and to your point, I did experience race via newspapers,
absolutely,
magazines, entertainment, which defined and constructed who was who.
Yes.
You're right. So thank you for not pushing back, but
I was just trying to clarify.
No, this is good. We are demonstrating. This is one of those things of, oh, geez, if I say something wrong, then I'm going to get pinged for it. Yeah, well, this is how we all get better. So thank
modeling
you.
in the moment. I hope y'all clued into that, dear listener. So last thing, talk a little bit, Sean, about why, or actually we both can, but you start about why we need white guys engaged.
Well, we need them because I think our progress has been limited and will continue to be limited.
Yeah.
And like I described with some statistics, white men do hold the majority of the positions of power. And make decisions. And it's not hard to do some research into terms of what's the makeup of our governors, of our Congress, of the CEOs, of the head coaches in any sport, you name it. So let's just, and that's not a judgment. That's just like, let's get real in terms of the situation at hand. And so if they're not involved, if we are not involved with white men of assessing the inclusivity.
Yeah.
See,
how much have you been drinking? How much? What's the alcohol by volume on that beer, man?
I can't even say the damn
inclusivity,
thing.
Brother.
Yeah, inclusivity. I'm gonna cut that out anyway. If we're not evaluating that, and doing something again, I think most people want to be respectful and for people to show up and enjoy the environment and feel like they belong, but we have to do our part, and oftentimes we aren't, because we're not seeing the problem necessarily.
Yeah, and the thing about it is that we don't have to be even an active part of the quote unquote problem to be an active part of the solution, right? And so, as I often like to quip, if women could fix sexism, it'd have been fixed a long time ago. They need men. If Black folk could fix racial inequalities in the U.S., it would have been fixed a long time ago, right? We need white folks. If LGBTQ folks could solve all of the problems that they face societally and defeat the laws that are passed, even recently, this last year, even I'm probably sure some this year, but I know a lot last year that marginalized that community, then they wouldn't need us straight and cisgender folks to be in the game, right? So if the impacted group could fix the impact by themselves, then it would have been done a long time ago, right? So we need to be in the game on a number of levels.
A good example of the power dynamics and how those power dynamics show up in establishing laws and policies and procedures, which makes it harder for people who don't have the power to gain power.
You nailed it, my friend. I love it.
So here's the straight talk. White men, we need to assess why we're in this work and what we're doing today, and whether that is contributing to people feeling like they're included or not. We got to own that we are white men. We got to own that there is some power and privilege to that at the group level, right? We've got to learn what it means to be an ally. We got to listen to others and focus on the impact. And also, this final piece is we've got to be in a position to being led, be a partner in change.
Yes, absolutely.
Yield to others.
Yeah.
Right. So and that's a shift too, because we've been trained to be in charge and to tell people what to do. And in this scenario, it's like, just create a safe environment where people can share the impact with you and give you a sense of what you can do, but also making sure you're doing your part to learn what you can do, and just and start showing up and behaving differently and creating that change, or as we've said, be the change that you want to see.
Yeah, man, I couldn't have put it better myself. I love how you wrapped that up.
So we got many more ahead. We got a year ahead of us. Thanks for spending time with me and asking some questions, and us kind of shooting the bull a little bit around what this means for white men.
Well, I always enjoy the convos with you, no matter what the topic. But I hope, dear listener, you all like this new or sort of revised format where we're going to be a little bit more teachy. I know we kept promising that first couple of years, but didn't do it as much. We're really going to in 23 have intention around being a little more teaching, a little more applicable to what all you all are seeing in your corporate lives from a day-to-day basis. So again, like you said, Sean, more to come. I'm excited, man. I love doing this with you. I love this new kind of more rapid format as well. And not only do I love doing it with you and love the format, as always, I love you, brother.
Love you, brother.